Hi, this is Brett Atterbury from Pro-Life Magazine, and today I'm very honored to have with me Dr. Christopher Kaczor, author of the book The Ethics of Abortion, Women's Rights, Human Life, and the Question of Justice. Just to give a little background on Dr. Kaczor, he is a professor of philosophy at Loyola Marymount University in Los Angeles. He graduated from the honors program of Boston College, earned his PhD from the University of Notre Dame, and did his postdoctoral work in Germany at the University of Cologne as an Alexander von Humboldt Foundation Federal Chancellor Fellow and returned as a Fulbright Scholar. He's written many books, including The 7 Big Myths About the Catholic Church, The Ethics of Abortion, Thomas Aquinas on the Cardinal Virtues, Life Issues, Medical Choices, Thomas Aquinas on Faith, Hope, and Love, The Edge of Life, and Human Dignity and Contemporary Bioethics. Dr. Kaczor's research on issues of ethics, philosophy, and religion has been in the Wall Street Journal, the Huffington Post, National Review, NPR, BBC, EWTN, ABC, NBC, Fox, CBS, MSNBC, and The Today Show. Welcome, Dr. Kaczor.
Hello, thanks for having me.
Boy, there's a lot of, I was going through a lot of those those NPRs, BBCs, and all that. You've been on a lot of shows.
Yeah, a lot of letters, huh?
That's right. So, as I was discussing with you earlier before we started the interview here, I read the book, The Ethics of Abortion, Women's Rights, Human Life, and the Question of Justice. It's a very comprehensive book, and you go into so much detail on so many issues of pro-life. It's not light reading. It's certainly, it takes some time to delve into and think about, but there's so many interesting things in there that I thought would be great to bring to our audience. So my first question for you was, what was your motivation for writing this book?
Well, the book started actually when I was in college, in a way. I had a pro-choice roommate, and we used to argue for hours and hours about abortion, going back and forth. And one of the things that I realized is that, you can discuss this issue in a reasonable way, in a civil kind of way. And so I thought there's really a need to discuss the pro-life perspective in that sort of way. So I try to reach out to people that disagree with the pro-life perspective in a very reasonable and civil manner, and really engage them, hopefully in a way that can help them to move from seeing abortion as a fundamental right of a woman to really seeing how abortion involves not just a woman's body, but also the body of someone else, that is a human being that's in utero and growing towards birth. And so it took me some time to write the book. It was about 8 years in the process, but I'm very happy with it, and I'm actually told by the publisher there may be a second edition of the book coming out, so that's kind of exciting for me.
Oh yeah, that is exciting. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Of the many issues you analyze in the book, one of the things that really stuck out for me is this argument between the perceived difference between a human being and a person, or what you call personhood. And can you tell me a little bit why defenders of abortion use this distinction?
Sure. In everyday speech, people use the term person and human kind of interchangeably. But in the philosophical literature, there's developed a kind of technical distinction between the two terms. So when people defend abortion, some people will say things like, well, there's no life there. But, in terms of the scientific perspective, it's really indubitable that the human embryo and the human fetus are growing and assimilating nutrition, and there's really no way to deny that there's some kind of living being there. And then other people want to say, well, yes, this is alive, sure, but it's not a human being. But again, that becomes pretty difficult to defend from a scientific perspective, because this is a being that has human tissue, it has two human parents, it's a being that has human DNA and human blood. So, really, in terms of the empirical evidence, it's pretty impossible to deny that this is a living member of our species. So philosophers came along and basically said, well, okay, fine, it's a living thing, yes. Yes, it's a human being in the sense that it's a member of our species, but it's not a person. And what they mean by person is a being that has moral significance, a being that has basic rights, a being that we ought to respect. And so their view is to say, look, yes, the human fetus is a human being, it's a member of our species, but this human being is not a person. It doesn't have basic rights. We don't need to respect it or protect it by law. So that's basically their view. And so a lot of the book is taken up with looking at the reasons why they think human beings in utero prior to birth are not persons, and trying to show that these reasons really don't work. And that's sort of not the whole book, but that takes up a good chunk of the book, because most pro-choice arguments are based on the denial of either the humanity or the personhood of the human being in utero.
Okay. And from your perspective as a philosopher, is that distinction that they're making there between human being and person, is that more morally relevant from your perspective, and why or why not?
Well, I would say there is a distinction between a human being and a person, in the sense of it's possible that there are non-human persons. So, for instance, there could be alien persons. You can imagine intelligent life, some other part of the galaxy or something, and if there were intelligent beings, they would be non-human persons. And for religious people believe also in non-human persons. So, for instance, Christians would believe in the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Now, those are divine persons, not human persons. And they believe in angelic persons and demonic persons. And so I don't really need to get into whether or not there are such things as non-human persons, but the idea makes sense. It's possible that there could be non-human persons. The question really is not about that. The question is about, should all human beings count as persons? And I try to make the argument that all human beings do count as persons. Now, there may be other non-human persons. Maybe there are, maybe there aren't. But we don't really need to get into that. What's relevant in terms of the abortion debate is, are all human beings persons? And I argue that they are. And I think one of the best reasons for thinking that is to look at history. In the course of human history, many times we've divided the human family into two different groups. And we've said, okay, well, this group of people, say white people, count as persons, but this other group of human beings, say African Americans, well, they don't really count as persons. And so, we can own them, we can abuse them, they don't really count. Other times people have said, well, if you're European, you count as a person. If you're a native, some human being that's a native person, well, they don't really count. Other times it's, well, men count as persons and women, they don't really count as full persons. So we've done this over and over again. But every single time we've ever divided the human family into those that count as persons and those that don't count as persons, every single time we've ever done this, we've made a horrible mistake. And when we look back on those episodes in history, we always say, oh, this is just a tragedy with a tragedy to divide the human community in this way. And so I think, efforts today to exclude some human beings from counting as persons are just as nefarious as these prior attempts. So what I basically argue for in the book is an inclusive view. And I say, look, every single human being, regardless of race, regardless of religion, regardless of sex or any other characteristic, including birth, every single human being should be accorded basic respect and should be protected by law. And so that's kind of what I argue. And I think that, again, we have the very best prudential reasons for taking this point of view in light of the fact that every single other time we've ever made this distinction between human beings that are persons and human beings that are not persons, every time we've ever done this, we've made a horrible mistake.
Right, okay. And one part of your book I found interesting was the famous A Defense of Abortion paper by Judith Jarvis Johnson, where it appears that she grants that the human embryo has the status of a person, yet she still defends abortion rights. And can you explain why she does that? Sure, yeah.
Judith Jarvis Johnson has a famous article called A Defense of Abortion, and she says, among other arguments, imagine you wake up one day and you're attached to a famous violinist, and the doctors come in and say, well, this violinist is sick, he needs your body to use your body for the next 9 months, and the violinist is the person, so you're not allowed to detach yourself. Well, Thompson says, look, even if the violinist is a person, we still have a right to detach ourselves from the violinist. And so abortion is a little bit like that. Even if we grant that the human being in utero is a person, it's fine for the woman to detach herself from the violinist and get an abortion. Now, the difficulty with this argument is, there were several difficulties, but one of them is that abortion really is not like detaching yourself from the violinist. Abortion, in fact, is a way of harming the body of the violinist. And so if we had the same violinist analogy and you came in there and said, well, I want to detach myself from the violinist, but I'm not going to snip the cords that attach us together. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to attack his body and chop up his body or otherwise attack his physical well-being. Well, I think people would see right away, well, look, you can't do that. If the violinist is a person, the violinist has a right to bodily integrity. And if the human being in utero is a person, the fetus is a person, well, then the human being in utero also has a right to integrity. And so the violinist argument fails, I think, in part because, in fact, abortion is not a kind of gentle detaching of yourself from the human being that's developing in utero, but rather is a very violent attack upon the physical bodily integrity of the human being in utero. Secondly, there's a big difference also in that in the violinist argument, you're attached to the stranger. And it's very nice to help out those in need. And according to some religious traditions, there's actually a duty to help those in need. But every religious tradition and the law also recognizes that parents have special duties and responsibilities for helping their own children. So I'm a father, and it'd be very generous of me if I were to, I don't know, give food, shelter, and clothing to strangers I don't know. That'd be wonderful for me to do. But I don't have an obligation to, provide all these things for every stranger I run across. By contrast, for my own children, I do have an obligation to provide all those sorts of things. And I have a special obligation, above all else, not to intentionally harm my own children. And so in the violinist analogy, one of the ways that it fails to show that abortion is justified is that in the violinist analogy, you're attached to the stranger who's a violinist, and you don't owe any special responsibility or duty towards strangers. By contrast, in the case of abortion, a woman is pregnant with her own child, her own baby, and both biological mothers as well as biological fathers do actually have serious duties to their own biological children. And that's why, for instance, people recognize that biological fathers are responsible for paying, for instance, child support for their own children. And it doesn't matter whether or not they were trying to prevent conception, whether or not they wanted to be a parent, whether or not whatever, they still have very serious responsibilities for taking care of their own children in terms of child support and much more. And so in a similar way, I would say that biological mothers also have special responsibilities for their own biological children, including the responsibility to gestate them in utero until birth.
Yeah. As I read through, that's the one thing that hit me when I read the violinist argument was that issue that you're discussing, which is one about responsibility. It seems to me that for the most part, when the act happens that generates children, there is a responsibility there versus in the violinist argument, the person just didn't know what happened, just woke up and suddenly was attached to the violinist. So it didn't seem parallel to me.
Right. That's right. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. All right. Last question. The last chapter of your book, you bring up a very interesting idea, which you call the artificial womb. And could you talk a little bit about that? And it hit me that this could be kind of a middle ground for defenders of abortion rights and critics of abortion rights. Can you give some detail about this concept of artificial womb?
Sure. The idea would basically be that rather than having a woman who with an unplanned pregnancy, rather than having her have an abortion that ends the life of the human being in utero, what would happen was that the woman would just simply end the pregnancy and have the human being in utero removed and gestated outside the uterus. So right now in the United States, there are many intensive care units that take care of babies that are very premature. And these intensive care units, sometimes there'll be a baby who's only 22 weeks, 23 weeks, 24 weeks old. And so right now scientists are working on extending earlier in pregnancy the line of viability so that a child would be viable, maybe at 15 weeks or 10 weeks or maybe even from the very beginning from conception. Now, if this were possible, what would happen is that when a woman became pregnant unexpectedly and didn't want to remain pregnant, she could simply have the child removed and placed in what would amount to an early adoption, so that the child wouldn't be in her body any longer. And so the flaw plus side, from the pro perspective, is that obviously this would save potentially millions of babies' lives. And the plus from the pro-choice perspective is that women who did not want to be pregnant wouldn't have to be pregnant any longer. They could just go in and have this removed, and the baby would be able to live, and the woman would be able not to be pregnant. So this could be a kind of win-win. Now, I'm not sure whether this will be acceptable to all people on both sides, but I do think it would be acceptable to many people who are pro-life. I actually first heard about this idea from a pro-life pioneer named Bernard Nathanson, who was he was for a long time very much in favor of abortion. He's one of the founders of the Abortion Rights Action League, but then had a kind of conversion to the pro-life perspective. And I remember hearing him give a talk in which this possibility was mentioned. So at least for many pro-lifers like him, he's since passed away, but for people like him, and then also for many people that are in favor of abortion, like Judith Jarvis Thompson that we talked about, she mentions in her article that if it were possible to remove the human fetus from the uterus without killing it, then that would be what there's an obligation to do. So for not every single pro-life person and not for every single pro-choice person, but I think for a good number of both, this could be a possible solution. Now, whether it's technically possible, right now it's not, but that's a matter for scientists to determine. And I imagine if science continues to progress, at some point it will be technologically possible.
Yeah, it's interesting when you talk about that. Is it 50 years, 100 years, 200 years? We don't know, but it does seem if technology continued to progress at its current pace that would be something that would become feasible sometime in the future. And wouldn't it be very interesting if something like that, a technological advance, was, I don't know if it would definitively end the pro-life, pro-choice arguments, but could certainly have a significant dent in that situation.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, certainly, I think it would cause some people to reevaluate their positions and think about it in a new way.
Yeah. Well, Dr. Kaczor, I appreciate your time today. This is it's an incredible book. I encourage everybody to read this. It's definitely not light readings. It's not something for the beach on a Saturday afternoon, but if you really want to understand the arguments, both pro-life and pro-choice, and what's behind those arguments, and see how Dr. Kaczor evaluates them, this is a wonderful book to do that. So, again, Dr. Kaczor, I appreciate your time. Thank you for everything you do for pro-life. I appreciate it.
Oh, sure, my pleasure. And thanks for the interview, and thank you for all your kind words about my work. Appreciate it.
All right, take care.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.